Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Global Problematique Symposium here at George Mason University. My name is Bardia Merabian, and I'm a member of the Global Problematique Working Group, a registered George Mason University student group within the School of Conflict Analysis and Resolution. We are a student-led organization dedicated to shedding light on the vaguely defined global problematique, as well as adding to the overall literature of conflict analysis and resolution. But before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the presence of the Associate Dean of ESCAR, Ms. Julie Shen, to talk briefly about the School of Conflict Analysis and Resolution and its role and impact at the university, as well as the nation's capital. Thank you.
Well, welcome everyone. On behalf of Dean Andrea Bartoli, who is teaching tonight, otherwise he would have been here to do this welcome, welcome to the Global Problematique Symposium. One of the really interesting things that happened to ESCAR was in 2004 when we left the Fairfax campus, where we'd been since 1982, and came to Arlington. And part of the reason we came to Arlington was exactly for events like tonight, so that we could connect with experts from outside of the academy who are working on issues that are important to students of conflict resolution and practitioners of conflict resolution. I think tonight's especially exciting because this is a student-run, student-led, and student energy event tonight, and I think they've done a wonderful job putting it together. I'm certainly not the featured speaker, and there's people you want to hear from besides me, so I'll leave it at that, but definitely a welcome, and welcome to our new building here on the Arlington campus, Founders Hall. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. So, the entire vision, work, and product of this evening has been created and coordinated by master's students attending the School of Conflict Analysis and Resolution. And the event you see here now is a direct reflection of the hard work of those students to make this a success. A special recognition must be given to those who have been working on this event for the last 4 months, and they include Ms. Tatiana Medina, Ms. Melissa Butts, Ms. Martha Cooper, Ms. Cassie Amen, and Mr. Quo de Graaf Johnson, as well as myself, of course. The working group would also like to recognize ESCAR and its administrative staff for all of their support, as well as George Mason University's University of Life for making this event possible. The Global Problematique Working Group is born out of Dr. Sendoli's course here at ESCAR titled Global Governance and Complex Problem Solving in the Post-9/11 World. It is a course that focuses on the events that took place in the last decade. And an article from a July 9th, 2008 issue in The Economist. It made the case that the current infrastructure for global management is irrelevant to the problems of the 21st century. Global warming, pandemics, deforestation, poverty, population increases, WMD proliferation, resource scarcity, terrorism. Many global systemic problems are not confined by borders or sector. These globalized problems overwhelm the ability of current Westphalian rules and discourse in handling these problems. This discourse has been rendered obsolete in attempting to address the complex, interconnected, cross-border matrix of systemic problems and conflicts. Unilateralists need not apply. These various global systemic problems comprise the global problematique and make the task of addressing it to become exponentially complicated. However, this does not mean that the task is impossible. It just requires innovative and sustainable approach to address the multidimensionality of the global problematique. This is the mission of the Global Problematique Working Group: to identify, analyze, and propose practical approaches to peace building in the complex matrix that is the global problematique. This symposium is a first step in achieving that mission and requires the active participation of interested and dedicated individuals such as yourselves. We have invited panelists from various sectors who will aid us in understanding various aspects of the global problematique and convey practical approaches and solutions in addressing the myriad of global problems. We will then give you, the audience, the opportunity to ask questions to the panel for a brief period. Following a Q&A, we will begin roundtable discussions alongside a period of catered appetizers for the remainder of the evening. So I would like to begin with introducing the panelists. First, I would like to introduce Dr. Danya Maria Twyman. She is CEO of Virtual Office Associates, as well as Dr. Sekou Touré, who is the Conflict Resolution Commissioner at the Global Environmental Facility, a division of the World Bank, as well as Jorge Roldan, who is part of the Inter-American Investment Corporation, and as well as Dr. Dennis Sandoli, professor here at George Mason University, and my mentor, as well as many other students here at the School of Conflict Analysis and Resolution. So before I begin, I would like to ask Dr. Sandoli to approach the panel and begin to discuss and introduce what is the global problematique in its very broad sense. Please introduce Dr. Sandoli.
Thank you, Bardia. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Tatiana. Thank you, Kwa. Thank you, Martha. Thank you, Melissa, and all others who have participated in making this event happen. Bardia, in particular, who created the Global Problematique Working Group after taking one of my courses, which he mentioned, a bit of a tongue twister, Global Governance and Complex Problem Solving in a Post 9/11 World. And that leads me to say a few words about the Global Problematique. What is it? The Global Problematique, for me, a term of art that I kind of invented, refers to problems that, as Bardia indicated, transcend nation-state borders and frontiers, problems that no one nation can solve on its own, global warming being a clear example, global terrorism being another example, forced migrations, pandemics, etc., and that the only way these problems can be addressed is by nations and international organizations collaborating in coordinated fashion in working on the problems and their solution together. That's not happening too well as we speak, primarily because of persistence of the dominant nation-state paradigm of realpolitik, which has nations define their interests in narrow, zero-sum national terms, despite the problems which are violating those paradigm-based assumptions. The global problematique is also of interest to us because, in addition to the interconnections amongst these various problems that transcend nation-state frontiers, these problems are also drivers of conflicts that we normally do pay attention to. But we pay attention to those conflicts without paying attention at the same time to global warming, to global terrorism, to global poverty, Paul Collier's bottom billion quickly becoming the bottom 2 billion. And hence we continue to ignore these problems at their peril. So the problematique is twofold. Problems that no one nation can solve on its own, problems that are interconnected, not just with each other, but with conflict as well. So that's the background of tonight's presentation. And our speakers have been identified as being relevant to aspects of the global problematique. I will ask each of them to say a few words about themselves, and then ask them a few questions that they can then respond to, which will basically be their presentation. After all four, our fourth speaker is on her way, after each of the four has introduced him or herself and answered our questions, we'll then have a Q&A, as Bardia has indicated. So, let me proceed on to our speakers. Mr. Jorge Roldan, please, sir, say a few words about who you are and indeed your relevance or connection to the global problematique as we've defined it, and then I'll try to share with you some questions that our bright young students have put together, which I believe they shared with you.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here. Good evening. Thanks for inviting me. It's great to be back in school. I enjoy it every time. It's great to be challenged by questions. It's something that we have in the office all day, but when we're not in the academic world, I feel more freedom to say what I think. And that will be interesting to do. We can speak our minds more freely. My background, I'm a Colombian citizen. I came to the United States 22 years ago to work with an international institution called the Inter-American Investment Corporation, which is a financial institution, but it's a special financial institution. It's a development financial institution with a very unique mandate to support the creation, expansion, and modernization of small and medium-sized companies in Latin America and the Caribbean. It's a great challenge. It's hard to do, to invest and lend money to small and medium-sized companies and to do it in a sustainable way, because that's our mandate. We're not supposed to be giving away money. We're supposed to make those investments and those loans, recover the money, and roll the money again. And throughout that process of 22 years, we've learned a lot about conflicts of different kinds. Clients that don't pay because they don't want to. Clients that don't pay because they can't. Clients that don't pay because something happened to their companies. And it's a process that we have to engage with them and work through the system, sometimes with the peculiarities of judicial systems in each of the countries. I've been doing this for 22 years in the IIC. It's called the Inter-American Investment Corporation. It's part of the Inter-American Development Bank Group. Before that, I was a moneymaker in a financial institution in another country, in Venezuela, where I lived for 4 years. Before that, I was an economist in the Development Programs Division of the National Planning Department of Colombia, my home country. So I worked there for 1.5 years. I was a professor at my alma mater at the Universidad de los Andes in Bogota. I was a professor of development economics. Before that, I earned my PhD in the Sorbonne in France in international finance and economics. And I also hold a master's degree in economics from the university in Colombia. I enjoy what I do. I do it with a lot of passion. I love conflict, especially because I try to find the way to resolve those conflicts.
Thank you, Dr. Roldan. Let me now share with you, sir, some questions that our students have put together for you to consider responding to. Cycles of crisis dating back from the 1980s. I'm passing through history quickly and I'm losing my sense of decades. Prove how essential international and government regulators are in maintaining a healthy market. With the rise of technology globalizing financial markets, policy and economic decisions produce global consequences requiring coordinated responses between various sectors and nation states. Unfortunately, part of the problem in responding to the problematique is the lack of coordination between development, policy, humanitarian aid, and private businesses in order to address the complex issues in just the financial sector alone, let alone the various other sectors affected. So here's our question, or our questions, Dr. Roldan. What lessons can we learn from previous crises, and how can we decrease the possibilities of future global economic crises? Can you provide examples of successful responses that have promoted development and prevented crisis? And finally, did they require coordinated efforts across various sectors? Your responses, sir.
A very tough question, as you may imagine, to answer in few sentences. I would have to start with a joke so I can think. There was this very shrewd diplomat who was asked what he thought about heaven and hell. And he said, maybe I better not opine because in both places I have very good friends. I think that we haven't learned. What lessons have we learned? We haven't learned many lessons. I think crisis should have taught us some lessons. In my particular field of expertise, which is finance and economics, I thought that we would have learned lessons out of the crisis that we had in the 1980s with the debt problem. During the 1970s, we had the oil shocks. And there was a boom of money moving around the world because there were a lot of dollars going to the oil exporting countries. Even they formed a cartel, the OPEC. And they were awash with cash. What did they do? They started lending that money. How? They didn't do it on their own. They put the money in banks. American banks, European banks, Asian banks, especially from Japan. And that money was then channeled to countries, especially developing countries, that were taking that money because it was cheap. And they were not a very shrewd way of making sure that those loans were backed up in a way that could be repaid. And what happened? 1982, the crisis exploded. Mexico, Korea, Brazil, even Russia, India started to have problems paying their debts. And then you have to tighten the screws. So the IMF came into play, and they started introducing all these policy reforms and all these packages of loans that had conditions. And so countries had to really adapt to a new reality and try to pay back as soon as they could with a lot of hardship. Of course, society was left paying the bill and lots of problems. That was the crisis of the 1980s, debt crisis. We should have learned the lesson. The lack of regulation, my thesis, and actually that was my work for my PhD dissertation, was that in times of boom, there is little regulation. In times of crisis, we introduce regulation. And the 1980s should have taught us a lesson. Regulation is needed in the international financial market in order to make sure that the liquidity that is created with all this money that goes around the world is used in a way that secures a financial system that is stable. Fast forward to 2008, what happened? We had the bubble of the mortgages in the United States. We had the bubble of the mortgages in Europe, especially in London, in England. And that burst as well. Lack of regulation, and this time much more complicated. Here, the financial innovations that were introduced in the years 2000 through 2008 allowed banks to package mortgages and sell those mortgages as securities. They even got the rating agencies involved, and they got AAA ratings for these packages of mortgages. They sold securities backed by the mortgages, and they multiplied that again by packaging again the packages that were packaged before, and they created all this huge bubble. And who was watching? Nobody. The Fed said, this is the market. We are in the monetary system. We are in monetary regulation. This is financial. We don't get involved. The Securities and Exchange Commission was not involved deeply. So it did burst in 2008, and we are in the mess we are now and trying to get out, which has been very difficult. Interestingly enough, my world of work is Latin America and the Caribbean. Those countries went through those crises before, and they adopted regulations that now do not allow financial institutions and financial markets to do all these crazy things. So if you see, you don't hear the crisis hitting Latin America today because the countries have adopted regulations. So I think we have learned lessons. I don't think we are applying them across the board. Latin America and the Caribbean went through a very hard time during the 1980s. We call it the lost decade. And what's happening today in the developed world is not happening, at least in Latin America, in the vast majority of countries, not all of them. I'm not answering the question completely, but I think we have learned some lessons, but I don't think we have learned all of the lessons that we can learn, especially when it deals with managing crises of the sort that we're living today in the financial world. I'm going to stop there and try to pick up again later.
Thank you very much, Dr. Roldan. You've given us a lot of food for thought. Dr. Secutore, sir, please say a few words about yourself as Dr. Roldan did, and then we'll put you some questions.
Sure. Well, it's my name is Secutore. I work for the Global Environment Facility. We are inside the World Bank. It is a around $5 billion trust fund that we manage. Essentially, we provide grants to developing countries. So all our work is in developing countries. And this grant goes to governments. We agree with governments on a set of policy areas that need financing. And we have a replenishment process every 4 years. This trust fund is replenished. And this money goes into supporting policies, developing specific projects in the field to address several environmental issues. Clearly in our work, there are 6 main areas. I'm not going to go into details. Maybe we'll have the time to go into them much later. It is a unique experience that was started 20 years ago, and it has evolved to be a system that is showing some results. Essentially what it is, you have a small secretariat that we manage out of Washington, and then we have a set of 10 agencies that we call implementing agencies. These are international organizations. It's a mix of UN agencies. I'm sure that most of you are familiar with UN agencies, and development banks. The World Bank, the regional development banks, all of them, all 6. And we use the expertise in those institutions to assist the developing countries come up with project concepts, and we fund these activities. Projects are implemented, and then we monitor and follow up and collect some data to see if we are achieving some global environmental benefits. This is our area, our main goal in the GEF. You can imagine in a system like this where you are managing about $5 to $6 million a year. You have 10 implementing agencies and a whole range of executing entities at national level. This could be government entities, it could be NGOs, it could be some banks. All of them involved in a network that can be extremely noisy. You have this noise that comes from various corners, either local communities complaining about the impact of the projects in the field, when our expectations and our hope is to go and solve those issues, whether it is an allocation system of resources among those entities, whether it is a government official or a country that is complaining about one of the agencies not performing as they had anticipated. So briefly, this is the kind of work we do at the GEF. We are there to just oil this whole system, and you can imagine it's very, very exciting. We spend sleepless nights in that work. I'm privileged to be with my assistant Malvika here. So my background, very, very briefly, I'm a civil engineer, hydraulics engineering. I did my PhD at the University of New Hampshire in environmental engineering. When started teaching, so I miss these classrooms once in a while. Went back home. I'm from Côte d'Ivoire. If anybody speaks French here, maybe after we speak English, we can go in the corner and speak a little French. Work at home at the university, did some research work, advised governments on a number of things, became minister in charge of water, and then left government and then went to the UN, was director of regional office for Africa at UNEP, United Nations Environment Program, for a while, and then moved into the Global Environment Facility because UNEP is one of the implementing agencies of the GEF, and walk into this job. So basically this is a way of introducing myself, and we're involved in a lot of other little things here and there.
Dr. Torres, thank you. Let me put to you some questions, which I think your background, your rich background, is amply relevant to. Current discussions on global warming and environmental degradation seems to remain focused on the environmental impact of those problems, with little discussion on the societal impact. In other words, we are aware of rising sea levels and more volatile weather patterns, but the general public seems to remain in the dark about what that means in the socio-political arena. Therefore, and here's our questions for you, what kind of impact does global warming and environmental degradation have on society? Do these aspects of the global problematique produce conflict? If they do, in what way? And finally, how important is it to focus on the link between environment and conflict? Please, sir.
Well, certainly. What is very interesting in our field of work is that the early days, up until, let's say, 1960, 1970, most governments and individuals had, very, very little awareness in terms of the impacts of environmental degradation on their lives. It was seen as a remote problem that was not so relevant. I think we have come a long way. Things have moved tremendously. But we are facing greater challenges. When you look at the consumption patterns in these industrial nations, you see, I come from Côte d'Ivoire, and if you went and found any Ivorian, their dream is to have a lifestyle like an average American. And what we tend to forget is that the patterns of living in this society is such that if I don't know how many billion people we have around the globe, if everybody were to have the same lifestyle, I tell you, we will deplete our natural resources in a very short period of time. So the whole notion of living is around our natural resources. You need water, you have to drink water, you have to take your shower in the morning. You produce some wastewater. That wastewater is discharged somewhere in the environment. What most people do not know is that when we collect your wastewater, it has to be treated. Otherwise, if you pour this wastewater in the environment, it creates some health-related issues. While you're trying to improve your standard of living, you are creating conditions for expansion of diseases, waterborne diseases, among others. And to compound all that, we have this very, very difficult global issues that is related to global warming, the ozone depletion, and these are some of the terms I'm sure you're quite familiar with. You see, we are consuming, we are generating a lot of wealth. Everybody would like to have electricity, all right? I bet a lot of people do not know how this electricity is generated. If you knew that coal is being used to produce this electricity, and that coal is generating so much greenhouse gases that is being emitted in the atmosphere, which is actually affecting the balance in the environment. Because the system has been evolving over hundreds and thousands of years to reach this equilibrium. And unfortunately, our way of life is disturbing that equilibrium that we have in around us. Global warming has this terrible, terrible impact on us, which is everything actually is driven by energy. Yourself, you get up in the morning, you need some energy to go. A tree cannot grow without energy. So if we disturb this cycle, and we are doing it, and there is body of evidence, the scientific research, there is no question about this issue of global warming. There is the side of global warming that a lot of people do not discuss, and I'm very glad that you're raising it. What are the social impacts of global warming, broader environmental degradation in general? And let me start in the water sector. And I'd like to relate to what I know best. I'm from a developing country. When you live in Africa, you really feel some of these things. What is happening is that when you look at the northern part of the Africa continent, I'm sure that you all can see how Africa is and what it is like. The drier some of the regions get, the more difficult it becomes to grow anything. So what is happening is, hey, we are human beings. Nobody would like to die of hunger or starvation or whatever you call it. They will move to go to areas where you know, they can just improve their lives and grow something and feed themselves. So you see this massive movement from areas that are extremely dry. As they get drier, you know, this movement intensifies. Can you imagine, you know, some nomad people living in their own environment for hundreds of years, forced into, you know, coming into, settling into areas where they never lived before? You displace people, and you change their way of life. You force them to change their way of life. Water resources become scarcer. And the basic, I mean, I think the most telling story that we like to come back to regularly is, you know, these international waters, an area where we pour a lot of resources in. You know, when you take the Nile, or any major river for that matter, you see rivers have this tendency of creating life. People like to live around rivers. You have water, you can do a number of things. And as, you know, people move towards those kind of areas, there's a fight for land. And I tell you, where we come from, the most difficult issue to deal with is land issues. Because, you know, hey, we all believe that this land belongs to us. Our grandfather left this land to us. You cannot come from the US and come and take this land from me. I will fight you to death. So this is the underlying causes of all the things that you see in Africa. Oil. Okay, I discover oil. It should be a blessing. It becomes a curse because everybody would like to fight to get that resources. So at the end of the day, all these environmental issues are having a huge impact on society. Health-wise, resource depletion, changing the lives of the people, displacing them, and etc. and etc. So again, there are a number of instruments that hopefully we are putting in place today. Clearly, we'll get into some of those issues later. But clearly, we have to invest more into our understanding of what global warming is, what you know, environmental degradation means, what are the impacts on society in general. But you don't remain general, because some of these things are very, you know, individually driven. Take the issues to the local communities, involve them, and help them change their agricultural practices, their living conditions, to make sure that you know, all these become more environmental friendly. As you do that, you tend to limit the scope of potential conflict. Let me conclude, you know, here by telling you a major story. I mean, it's very interesting. You don't think about it. You see, when the GEF started about, you know, 20 years ago, biodiversity is one major focal area that we invest in. How to protect biodiversity. And the earlier days, the theory was, well, what you do is you try to create as many what we call protected areas as possible, so that at least, you know, you make sure that you protect the species, all kinds of species, whether it's trees or animals, so that, you know, this also the environmental movement of the early days. But in creating protected areas, you know, we ended up displacing a lot of people. Now, those days where they displaced people, there was an agreement with communities that we displace you from, you know, your traditional land. You are going to be settled somewhere, and you're compensated. All right, the terms were, you know, nicely described. But what happens in this displacement is that, you know, at the end of the day, you never, and I've never seen a case where all the commitments have been fulfilled. 15, 20 years down the road, people are realizing, listen, we were promised, you know, to move into nice areas, to have schools, and to have our kids dealt with, and nothing's happening. So people are taking us to court. So it's moving from conflict over resources. We think that we are providing the solution by trying to settle them in areas where we think, you know, we are okay. But in doing so, we are creating additional conflicts that we had not thought of initially. So it's an ongoing effort, and we have to keep updating our thinking, our approaches. And this is why forums such as this are extremely useful for us.
Dr. Torre, you have given us vivid, palpable examples of what the global problematique is and how it is a driver of conflicts worldwide as well. I'm sure you'll get many questions. Thank you very much, sir. Dr. Danya Marie Twyman, welcome to you as well, Madame. Say a few words, if you will, about who you are, and then we'll get to some questions for you.
Yes, sir. Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. Can you all hear me okay? Oh, okay. Again, my name is Danya Maria Twyman. I go by Danya Maria because I'm from Southeast Washington, D.C., and when your mother calls you by your whole name, that means something. It means hurry up and get your butt up there, and if enough people in the neighborhood hear you, that name sticks with you. She calls you by your whole name. I think some of you may have had that experience. Let me tell you a little bit about who I am and my company, which is Virtual Office Associates. And the reason that it's a virtual office is because most of our business is done online, and just about everything now is technology and internet driven. And so is civic engagement and conflict resolution, if you will. Also now driven by technology. Because what we are doing at Virtual Office Associates is not just what we set out to do, was to manage small business. Since 2005, we've changed our model to mostly be about public participation and civic engagement in minority communities. Our focus has been on communities that are least likely to participate in civic engagement, educating their children, community development and restoration, and any number of issues having to do with the environment. We discovered that there were not enough people involved in restoring the Chesapeake Bay, where I live. I'm in Annapolis, and right on the Chesapeake Bay, and we know historically there have been African Americans, Indians, and so on, different ethnic groups who make their living in the maritime community on the Chesapeake Bay. However, these are communities who are not involved in the restoration of the Chesapeake Bay. Chesapeake Bay is a major national treasure, and there simply are not enough people taking care of it or learning about environmental issues to restore not just the Chesapeake Bay, but the Anacostia River and the Potomac River, where I grew up. I grew up in Southeast Washington, right on the Anacostia, and actually witnessed for myself the degradation of the Anacostia River and the Potomac Rivers. These are places that I love, and the waterways are my passion, as well as my community. So I thought it would behoove me and my company to focus our attention on how we can involve more people in restoring the Bay, the Anacostia, the Potomac, and communities that are being taken over for any number of reasons having to do with development. But because people are not educated or literate enough to become involved, or either are intimidated by development coming into their communities. So we were excited when the EPA decided to make it a mandate that if you come into a community, you have to get people involved in the decisions about what happens to their communities. And because there were so few small businesses, people who look like myself, involved in civic engagement and public involvement, environmental justice, etc., I said, oh, this will be a good niche. This will be a good place to start, where we can get people involved, grow a small business into doing something a little bit outside of the box. And so we've developed into a think tank, if you will, about sustainable solutions to get more minorities, people of color, a variety of ethnic groups involved in environmental justice issues. And so that's Virtual Office Associates.
Yes.
And that's what we're doing. So,
Thank you, Dr. Twyman. Here are some questions that our group have put together for you, Madam. One aspect of the Joseph County 2012 campaign is that it was able to tap into young people to engage their political representatives to make a change that they believe in, or so it seemed. There is much discussion and criticism as to whether campaigns like the County 2012 actually make a difference. and whether ordinary people at the local level can make a difference, if at all. We have typically seen activism, such as people going to the polls and contacting the representatives in a functioning democracy, or taking to the streets in countries that do not have one. Our question for you, Dr. Twyman, is what kind of activism have you seen that is most effective? What made it effective? Can local activism have a global impact? If so, how? Dr. Twyman.
It's Ms. Twyman. I'm working on that PhD, not quite yet. Let me talk for a minute about a project I think that was identified by the graduate students here at George Mason, and that was the New Communities Project. It took place in a place called Berry Farms, which is in southeast Washington, D.C. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but Berry Farms was a farm back in the 1800s, and it was leased to the city of Washington as a model community for people who were migrating from Virginia, mostly African-American families who wanted to saw a dream of home ownership. A lot of them were leaving out of post-slavery and had no idea about certain living conditions having to do with urban living. They came to the District of Columbia. Barry leased his farm to the District of Columbia for 100 years. During that 100 years, we've watched Berry Farms grow from a thriving community to what some may term as a ghetto. And a ghetto in urban communities, as probably some of you know, is usually crime-ridden and has a lot of stigmas associated with it. Certainly has nothing to do with people who will come out and organize themselves to help develop their communities. We wanted to dispel the myth about the types of human capital that come out of public housing and disadvantaged communities by approaching new communities in a different way. And we did this by the Department of Transportation in the City of the District of Columbia, who was heading up a project, New Communities. As a matter of fact, it wasn't just the Department of Transportation. There were multi-agencies involved in developing New Communities. And New Communities is not special or specific to Southeast Washington. There are New Communities projects throughout the United States. What was special about my going into the District of Columbia, or my having been identified as someone who could actually affect change in the District of Columbia, or citizens who lived in public housing and disadvantaged urban living conditions, we felt that if we were to get people involved who were familiar with low-income and disadvantaged communities, who could speak the language of, the same language as people who live in these communities, then it could make a difference. That would be somebody who would listen to somebody who was familiar with them, somebody who looked like them, somebody who sounded like them, someone who came back from the same background and circumstances as people who live in these communities. It's seldom times, and I'm sure this can be statistically proven, that once you get your education, your PhD, if you will, you move out of the neighborhood and you never come back and you never participate and we never see you again. Sort of like a lot of alumni who don't pay their alumni dues. I know y'all don't know anything about that. But I came back to Berry Farms because I was from Southeast Washington, D.C. I did care about Anacostia. I still worship at my faith-based institution there. I still have relatives there. Even though I educated myself and moved to Annapolis, and I now live in a beach community on the Chesapeake Bay, my passion is still about people who live in disadvantaged communities, not just in Southeast, but around the globe. Same communities, same type of situation, regardless of where it's physically located. So we went into Berry Farms to implement a New Communities initiative. And what that meant was moving people out of their comfort level. People who don't usually talk to people who look like yourselves. They usually see people who look like yourselves come into their community and they go the other way. Well, what we did was we went and knocked on doors. We went to their faith-based institutions and invited them to meetings there, held a few carnivals to get people, and did things that were not the traditional charrette or community meeting or things that we're used to doing to get people in. As opposed to inviting people to come in, we went to the community. We took the development to the people in order to get their input, their buy-in. And so they were more apt to participate. They came to meetings. We had great success with people in Southeast Washington, D.C., the place where people said they would be least likely to have public participation in a new communities project. And it was a phenomenal success. We did the same thing in Cambridge, Maryland, whereby there is a street in Cambridge called Race Street. It's been Race Street for almost 40 years, since the civil rights movement started on the courthouse steps there, when the Panthers stood on the courthouse steps and declared war against America. And whites who live on one side didn't speak to the blacks who lived on the other side of the street for 40 years. So they engaged my company, Virtual Office Associates, to come in to look at this problem, to see if we could get people talking to one another. We had a phenomenal success by doing very simple things. Sitting on the porch. Sounds simple, doesn't it? But that's where people talk in certain cultural situations. They talk in the beauty parlor, in the laundromat, in the barber shop. They sit on the front porch at night and they talk with their neighbors. And they're least likely to talk to a professional person who's coming in as a facilitator and they're a big shot and they know everything. That's not who they're talking to. They're talking to people who look like me or people who look like yourselves, who go into your own communities and talk to people. That's where it starts. It doesn't start with a big idea. It starts with a small idea. It starts with asking your grandmother, what does she think about development in her community? It starts with Miss Janie, who only has a third grade education. We're talking about human capital. We're talking about identifying people who are least likely to have the big idea, but therein lies a small idea that can change how you affect a community, and it can change how you engage people. And we've seen some successes as a result of new communities and projects like new communities that are happening all over the country. Main streets, for example, whereby EPA is giving small cities money to reinvent and reinvigorate communities that have been left behind and left behind for so many years. But small communities are talking to one another. People do have bright ideas that we need to tap into. And so I encourage you, if you're interested in conflict resolution or public engagement and in any type, particularly in the context of environmental justice, that it is just to talk to people who may not give you the philosophical, theoretical answer that you've been reading about in your textbooks and so on. Some of the answers are very simple and can be found in very simple people. And so I hope that answers your question about what kind of engagement we've seen.
Ms. Twyman, soon to be Dr. Twyman, I think you're an inspiration to many of our students here, and I encourage you to think about applying to be a visiting professor of conflict resolution at the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution. An invitation I would tender to your colleagues as well, but you have reminded me that you're certainly relevant.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate that.
Thank you indeed. Dr. Myra Woods, welcome, Madame. Our protocol thus far has been to ask each of the four panelists to say a few words about themselves, after which then I put to you a few questions compiled by the students in our working group. So please let us know who you are.
Sounds good. First of all, good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
Good evening.
We'll try again. Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
All right, I'm just coming from another event, so I feel like I need your energy. Need to make sure you're with us. One more try. Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
Oh, yes, you are with us. Thank you. I so needed that. So, yes, I am Amira Woods. I work at a think tank called the Institute for Policy Studies, and I'm here because of Mimi, who has worked with us at the Institute, inviting me, so I thank her for the invitation. You know, it was tough coming to Virginia, but I made it, and I'm really grateful, and grateful that all of you have taken out time to be here. So I am originally from Liberia, and I feel like this is a wonderful segue. I don't even know what your question is, but it's a beautiful segue, because I think you're absolutely right when you say start meet people where they are, start with one thing. So again, because I'm from Liberia, I feel like we have the best example in terms of conflict resolution. We had probably one of the worst dictators. Anybody know that person's name in the room? Charles Taylor. He's at The Hague now, thankfully. But he's at The Hague for an extraordinary reason that many people overlook. And I just want to see, has anybody seen the movie Pray the Devil Back to Hell? Couple hands. Okay, anybody who didn't have their hand up, didn't shake their head, write it down. You can see it for free. It's PBS, so you can get it online, and there are all kinds of stuff linked to it. But it's beautiful because finally a film, a very short film, chronicles just what you're talking about, right? People taking the initiative to make change happen right where they are. Right? So the story, Pray the Devil Back to Hell, the devil being Charles Taylor, right? Those who prayed were women. Women who were tired after 26 years of war, who decided we have had enough, who started to organize. And it started with one woman, essentially in one church. In a church that had a huge history of a massacre, so we could talk about that as well. Why that church, right? But this one church, one woman said, let's have a women's group that tries to figure out what we can do to end this war. Right? One woman started out, many other women joined, didn't know quite what they were going to do or how they were going to do it, but they started meeting. And it started to grow. Right? Till they got then pretty much all of the mainline churches in Liberia working on an initiative for peace. At one of their meetings, there was a Muslim woman who came to the meeting and she said, this is a great initiative, but it shouldn't just be church women, and started to organize the mosques. So then you had this women-led, women-driven initiative for peace that was interfaith. Women essentially deciding we're going to do something simple, wear white t-shirts and go out marching every day. Hot sun, pouring rain, with our kids on our backs if need be. That's what they did, demanding peace. It's a wonderful story, including these women essentially withholding sex at certain times and shutting these men in at a peace conference and saying, you will not leave this hotel room until we have a resolution to this crisis. But in the end, it worked. So you can see the film, and yes, now Lema Bowie has won the Nobel Peace Prize as of December, but when they started out, no one thought they'd win the Nobel Peace Prize. It was just women tired of bearing their children, tired of not being able to put food on the table, to figure out how they would be able to survive, tired of the sexual violence that they had suffered, and they had watched their mothers, their aunts, their daughters suffer. So they took it on themselves. So it's an extraordinary story. But I think I'd love to start there, because I know there's all kinds of discussion about Kony, and I think part of why I'm here is also because people wanted to talk about Kony 2012 and all of that. But ultimately, it is people pushed to the brink who have made change happen. And it is others standing in solidarity. So if we look back, whether it's the movement to end slavery, the abolitionist movement, a global movement, but ultimately people pushed to the brink saying, we have had enough, right? Standing in solidarity, but with those in leadership who were at the forefront, needing to lead the struggle because of their experiences. The civil rights era, similar example, people at the forefront. It was those garbage truck workers, right, that said, I am a man. Okay, we can update that to we are people, right? But understand, treat me with dignity. Understand my need for basic human rights, basic civil rights, right? That is what ignited a movement that ended Jim Crow. If we think about the anti-apartheid struggle, it's another brilliant example. People pushed to the brink. It was children saying enough is enough, starting to organize in South Africa, and then people in universities like this one standing in solidarity saying, what can we do to push a divestment movement within our universities? Standing in solidarity, but not taking the space from, taking the agency from those who are at the brink, right? It's standing in solidarity with them. These, I think, are the lessons of history, and I think we are at an extraordinary moment now. It started out in Tunisia, and yes, that is in Africa, in Egypt, people forget, but it's actually 20 African countries that in the last year and a half have had tremendous movements, uprisings, revolutions, demands for change. We can talk about that if we had more time, but I think when we think about conflict resolution, we have to think about raising the voices, expanding the space for those pushed to the brink who have decided, taking it on themselves to organize, right? To choose activism, to choose a path for peace and justice. And all of us, as members of the human family, have a responsibility to stand with them, but we can't take away the space from them. So who am I? Yes, I'm a Liberian woman, I'm a feminist, I'm a peace activist, right? I'm a public scholar at a think tank here in DC, and I'm someone truly honored to be here with all of you this evening.
Dr. Woods, it is clear that you'll have to be our fourth visiting professor of conflict resolution after this evening. We do have a bit of time to segue into a question or two that you've already overlapped with, if you permit me.
Please.
We are entering into a new frontier of global awareness, and the proof is not having to explain who Joseph Kony, whom we refer to, is. During your last interview on the PBS NewsHour, the viral video on Joseph Kony and its fallout was discussed by you. You also discussed viable criticisms on a narrative that Invisible Children, the NGO behind the video, is attempting to convey. However, one thing that I was hoping, our group was hoping, would be touched upon by your good self, are the institutions, or lack thereof, that allow figures and groups like Kony and the LRA to exist, as well as the lawlessness that the Ugandan government themselves have conducted. So our question to you, Madam, is how important is the role of institutions and governments in conflict, and what efforts can be made to strengthen them? Does institution building and governance have international ramifications?
I feel like that could be a 2-hour answer, right? If I were to get started thinking about Uganda. But clearly institutions are key, especially movements of people are key. I think when it comes to Uganda, I think ultimately we have to recognize that there is a shift in terms of the significance of Africa overall, but places like Uganda as well, because of one key thing. Okay, I'll give you the hint. If you think about Iraq, you think about Afghanistan, one key 3-letter word, what would it be? Oil, right? Oil. We should think oil when we think Uganda, when we think Africa, right? Now about a quarter of the oil that comes to the United States comes from Africa. And increasingly it is places like Uganda that have recently discovered oil. That is, again, it's largely, we can go into all of those details. But the key is Africa is rising in its significance because of the centrality of Africa's resources for the global economy, but particularly oil, gas, and mining are kind of the three-headed monster, unfortunately. So in this context, again, I often make the reference to Iraq. It's not only in Iraq that where there's oil, there's military interests, right? So you have wonderful phrases coming out of the U.S. foreign policy operatives, but especially out of the Obama administration. President Obama went to Ghana and essentially said, Africa needs strong institutions, not strong men. And everyone, including me, applauded, right? But what seems to be happening is that there's one institution that's being focused on, and in the case of U.S. engagement with Africa, and that institution is typically, what do you all think it might be? Sorry? Department of Defense. I don't even need to be here, right? Clear. Department of Defense, right? The one institution that folks seem to want to bend over backwards to strengthen is the military, right? Building up military relationships because of the interest in accessing oil and other vital resources. This is the problem. Right? Which institutions? So I think what is key is to recognize that there are institutions that reinforce the dignity of people. Those people sitting on their stoops at Berry Farms, right? Right? The dignity of people throughout this planet. And how do we build up those institutions? Right? I think if we think about northern Uganda, essentially you had a rebel movement that started out 25, 26 years ago, primarily because the North was exploited, was seen as marginalized during the whole colonial period, and people started to say no, and started to organize, again, a rebel force to attack. That rebel force, i.e. Joseph Kony, that war ended about 6 years ago, which is my problem with the video. And I could go on and on and on about my problems with the video. And I know there's now Kony 2012 too, so yeah, it depends what video we're talking about, but for me they're all pretty kind of skewed because it ignores the fact that there's oil, and it ignores the fact that the role of the U.S. has been to build up militaries and is essentially calling in a military intervention under the guise of going after Kony, who has at most 200 to 400 forces, but essentially not in Uganda. The war ended 6 years ago, and all of that is sort of blurred or ignored in both Kony 12 version 1 and the second video. So institutions are key. Institutions that are needed are the institutions that help reinforce opportunities for people to express freely their will, their desire to control their own destiny, to control their own futures, to help determine the future of their children and their grandchildren. Right? Those are institutions like a free press. But unfortunately, it seems like we don't engage in those institutions too readily, unfortunately, in terms of U.S. foreign policy. Right? They're institutions of people, whether it's women's organizations, farmers' organizations, landless people's movements, unemployed workers' movements. Right? We have, for the past year and a half, movements all around the world, including right here in Washington, D.C. I don't know if there was one in Arlington, Virginia. These Occupy movements of people saying we need an economy that works for us. We have to protect not only the planet in terms of the environment, but we need an economy that works for all. So it's people all around the world that are demanding economic institutions that work better for the majority of people on this planet. But somehow those demands are not heard, or they fall on deaf ears. So the types of institutions that we need are institutions that will build up opportunities for particularly those that have been marginalized, historically discriminated, to actually have an opportunity for their full human creativity to be unleashed. It is those institutions like schools, including higher education opportunities that will help people to embrace new technologies even further, to be able to help us. There's this wonderful quote from a Burkinabe former liberation leader that says, "Dare to invent the future." Right? What we need are those types of institutions that help people dare to invent the future. And I think right now, when you see young people, when you see all the possibilities with Twitter and Facebook and all of the stuff in terms of communications, there's tremendous possibilities. But it's those types of institutions that unleash human creativity that need to be reinforced and strengthened, and not the institutions that bring further death, destruction, and injustice around the world.
Dr. Woods, thank you. You should be very proud, madam, to come from a country where a single woman nearly single-handedly created a movement that brought about the end of a terrible civil war and won the Nobel Peace Prize for her labors in that regard.
I have to say, she won the prize as Lema Bowie, but actually it was a movement of women all around the country, and she's really quick to recognize that as well. So read her book. The movie focuses a lot on a few women who were the top leaders, but Lema's book is called Mighty Be Her Powers. And the book goes much more in depth and I think holds up the movement as a whole. So
I
that's my 2
remember
cents.
seeing her portrayed in the recent PBS special, Woman Waging Peace.
Absolutely, that's the Pray the Devil Back to Hell movie.
Yeah.
Yes, it's a 5-segment series of women activists for peace all around the world, from Colombia to Liberia. I mean, literally all around the world.
Yemen.
So, Yemen, yes, Afghanistan.
Thank you again. Now we have about 10 short minutes for some questions from the audience. Our Q&A period. I'm sure there must be 1 or 2 people out there who are just thinking about something to say to either of you or 4 of you. Yes, sir.
I guess a question for anyone.
We're about to give you a microphone.
Well, I guess I'm just interested in the question of when we're dealing with international issues that cross borders, what are some of the ways we can increase communication across these radically different cultures? One thing that comes to my mind is the arts, somehow, perhaps. Music seems to cross borders quite nicely sometimes. But I thought I'd just throw that question out to some of you, or the gentleman from the Ivory Coast.
Dr. Torrey.
Do we go ahead or we take a set
I
of
think
questions?
we'll allow you to
Yeah.
respond as we go.
Absolutely. But clearly you have really touched upon 2 or 3 key things that one has to look into if you want to try to improve, these interlinkages among people and in various corners. But we can go a little deeper in the issue. And when you look at the environment as a whole, how institutions have been built now, we can draw a set of lessons. One is that you see, when you build institutions, people have to believe in them. And looking at what has happened in the field of the environment, first of all, we all recognize the problem. Biodiversity loss, climate change, land degradation, and around those set of issues, try to see what can be done at the global level, the regional level, and the local level to create this cooperation and collaboration and link, various people together. Then the issue of conventions come in. Once you recognize the problem, what you have to do, you have to come up with some form of binding instrument or some form of instrument that everybody believes in, would like to make sure to address, and make sure that when they participate in that set of tools, it will address their own issues. So in our field, we have a bunch of conventions. Conventions on climate change, convention on biodiversity, convention on land degradation. It is also a tool to encourage policy setting, to encourage the participation of people, and this has really spawned a whole range of NGOs, community types of actors, and her work in this particular field, for example, is in that context. And what is also crucial is that state actors are very, very important, bilateral relationships. So that is on the, what I call traditional institutional building side, and which we have been extremely successful at. But all those institutions, I think there is a history behind it. For example, if you live in northern Mali, where we all know what is happening, and she's from Liberia, I think we can speak to the same issues. You see, it's very interesting what happens in our areas, and this is where you learn things. People in Mali, in general, are herders, right? And they tend to move with their shepherd back and forth because, when it's dry, they have to go for greener pastures, right? They move with their animals south. And what happens is, as you move south, right, you don't displace people, but if you're not welcome, then clearly, you're creating a situation of conflict. And people have built mechanisms in place,
where, cooperation takes place among those who come with their herders for, to feed them, and then go back seasonally. Okay? And it creates a whole set of new dynamics in those regions where, people know that people coming from the Sahel, they will bring something to us and we'll give something back to them.
So, and it is also cultural. You see, as people move back and forth, you come, you get married to a local man or a local lady. Your kids are, from different cultures, and it creates these bonds, between communities. And we've seen it over years. This is why, some of us get extremely frustrated to see all kinds of funny wars in Africa. And I call them funny wars because, as she put it, if you were to leave these communities among themselves, very few wars, you will see very few wars. It's when interests come in, oil, or industrial exploitation of natural resources coming from outside and generating other interests, that some of these conflicts come in. Yes, what you have said is very crucial in building relationship, but there is also some institutional aspect, some cultural, and as well as some natural phenomenon when people need to leave and they have to move around, and that also creates this bond.
Dr. Rodin has...
Can I add something? I'm from a different type of perspective. I live in a micro world of finance helping small and medium-sized companies, so I come from a completely different perspective. I admire what you do, by the way. I'm a poor economist, so I have a hard time imagining doing all the work that you do and the impact it has. My little world is a microcosm with small and medium-sized companies. But there are issues. You talk about what can we do. I think education is a key element. Education across the board. And I'm going to give you an example of the things that we do that try to address conflict, but most importantly, fight corruption. Corruption is rampant in many places, and when money is involved, it's easy to fall into the trap of corruption. So we created this little program that we call FinPyme Integrity. FinPyme is a brand for our technical assistance program. It's an acronym in Spanish for Innovative Financing for Small and Medium-Sized Companies. And then we add names to it. One of the programs is called FinPyme Integrity. And we said, how can we do to train people and bring companies to do the right thing without imposing it from the top, bringing it from somebody in Washington telling you what to do. So what we did is we set a pilot program. That's how many of these things start, with pilots. And we talked to Transparency International. They told us, we do have a toolkit, but we won't give it to you unless we own the whole process. And we said, well, we want to just give it up and have somebody else tell us what to do. So we're going to create our own toolkit. We want to train trainers in the country so they go to the companies and tell them and teach them how to do the right thing. So we were fortunate to have a few sources of information. One, interesting, the U.S. Department of Commerce has an agency called the International Trade Administration, and they promote business ethics around the world. So they had some tools and some knowledge that we could tap on. Then we went to Korea. This is talking about the issue of South-South cooperation. South Korea became a shareholder of our institution. And in that process, they endowed us with a trust fund of $40 million. That's a lot of money coming from a previously poor country. And with that money, we engaged 16 experts in 3 countries in the Caribbean, in Barbados, in Jamaica, and in Trinidad and Tobago. And we looked up for these 16 people and brought them to Washington for 2 weeks. And we told them, here is your homework. You have to create a toolkit to go and train people in your countries on how to help companies adopt good practices of business ethics. And of course, these people knew what they were doing, but with the help of the U.S. Department of Commerce, with the people from the Korean Chamber of Commerce and Industry, with our own knowledge, we created this toolkit. And we tested it already. Last week was the final round of testing. And this toolkit will be put available on the web as a public good. Anybody will be able to download the toolkit and become an expert in teaching companies how to apply good norms and good practices of business ethics. First thing that you think is easy. Do you have a code of ethics? No, I don't. Well, here is a sample of what a code of ethics should look like. Do you train your purchasing manager? Oof, I don't. Well, here are some tools on how to train or how to query how the process is done in purchasing. Because the purchasing manager may receive money under the table and choose a vendor compared to the other, not regarding the interest of the company. Things like that, simple. And this is going to be our little contribution to the fight against corruption and to bringing more integrity into business processes. Again, my world is a very narrow one, but if we're successful, we're going to be making this toolkit available, more people being involved and interested in business ethics, and try to apply them in business.
Just one comment. Have you sent that ethical toolkit to Wall Street?
We'll do it for a fee.
For a fee, oh my goodness. You don't want to get to the fee issue. Coming out of a long meeting on fees, it's incredible,
Would either of our two other panelists like to respond to the question?
Oh, if there's time, I'd love to tell a
Please,
story.
please.
Is that okay?
Sure.
Okay, because your question just brings this wonderful anecdote to mind. So again, I keep saying I'm from Liberia, and I'm from a particular part in the southern part of the country, far from the capital city, Maryland County, but anyway, I could go on and on about that. Main point is, there's this incredible story post-conflict, always concerns that people are trying to rebuild the fabric of their lives. And there's a story that just recently documented of a UN representative coming into a community there in the southern part of Liberia, and essentially saying to people, what do you want? What are your needs? How can we help? Sounds like the right thing, right? Well, it's a great story because the community then met under the tree and talked and talked and talked, as we typically do, right, in our traditional ways, and came up with an answer. And they met the UN rep and said, what we need are resources to buy musical instruments for our brass band. And here the UN person said, what? Musical instruments? What do you mean you need musical instruments? Don't you need, wells? And they said, we, as a brass band, if we have a great brass band, people will come, and we have the tradition, like in New Orleans. I would love to do a global linkage on any anthropologists in the room. This needs really further study, because we do the brass band at funerals, and it's a big deal, right? And at all big occasions. So they said, if we have a good brass band, we will be able to have funerals done in the right way, but also we will be able to rebuild our local economy. People will come from all around to hear our brass band. And also, people will request for us to go to their communities, and they will pay us, right? So what we need are instruments. And unfortunately, I wish I had a happy ending to the story, but the story is that the UN person didn't give the resources, right? But I think it captures so much what you're getting at, which is that culture is at the root. Whether it's music or poetry or graphic arts, it's at the root of helping people survive during conflict and also helping people rebuild post-conflict. It is critical. And unless there is attention to culture, I don't think you can have a path for peace that's lasting. So I think your question touches on a core issue, and the lesson of the long story is really to say it's important to listen to people, and often people are recognizing the importance of culture in the process of conflict resolution and peace building. So key question. Thank you for that.
Dr. Would you remind us why it's important for international development agencies to pay keen attention to folks on the ground, to the voices of the local?
Absolutely.
We have time for one more question. Yes, sir.
For Dr. Roldan, what is your firm doing? What is your firm focusing on when it comes to how are you measuring social and environmental externalities within your investment, and then building metrics to hopefully further that cause?
That's a great question. Thank you very much. We are a financial institution. We are not any financial institution. We are a development institution. And therefore, the scarce resources that we have for making loans and investments have to be made making sure that we are adding value first, and that we're going beyond just the financing that we provide. Because if not, we will be just a commercial bank, lending money, because we do lend at market rates. The big difference is that we may lend at market rates, but long term, up to 15 years. The loans are up to 15 years in tenor, with interest rates basically based on LIBOR, which is the London Interbank Rate, plus a spread. And that spread measures our assessment of risk. And when we go out to financing, we just take any project. We have a lot of demand for our small amount of money. So we choose those projects where we think the developmental impact is going to be greatest. And I can tell you that over the years, I joined the IIC in 1990. That's 22 years ago. And I joined as an economist. My first task was to analyze developmental impact. Nothing was done about it for small loans. The World Bank has the International Finance Corporation, and they do have some methods of analysis, but are for larger loans. Our loans are smaller. And over the years, we have developed a system that today has become a standard and the best developed model, I think, for any international lending institution. It's called the DIAS, D-I-S, D-I-A-S, Development Impact Assessment Score. And that system scores the project in several areas of developmental impact, meaning job creation, foreign exchange generation, meaning exports or import substitution, technology transfer. Very importantly, environmental impact or environmental improvements, governance of the family-owned companies. The vast majority of our clients are family-owned, so we check how are they governed, can they improve the governance of the company. I don't know if you know that the vast majority of companies worldwide that are family-owned, more than 70%, do not exist after the second generation. They disappear, or somebody buys them. The owners, the original owners, create the company, they break their backs working hard, their children are, like it or not, into the company and become also part of the company, and the grandchildren are not taught how to be owners. And often they destroy the wealth created by their forebears. Because you may be the grandchildren, and you may be a great musician, or a politician, or a tennis player, and you can still be owner, but you have to learn how to be owner. And normally that doesn't happen. So we have programs to help the family-owned business to introduce best practices of governance, having a family protocol, introducing a succession plan, having a family council where decisions about the company are made in a professional manner. So we do that all the time. If the project doesn't have a high score in our deal system, it will be rejected. And our board of directors that approves our transactions expects that. Now, it's easier said than done, because sometimes you have to have some good business opportunities so you have a balanced portfolio. We cannot have all projects that are highly developmental but may have high risks. We have to have operations where we have a good development impact and also a good return for the IIC. But in that balanced approach, we seek to have projects that are to the outside of the spectrum, meaning high development impact and high return for the IIC. So we have this system, and it's scored all the time. We keep track of it, and I'm going to with that one word that doesn't exist in the dictionary, by the way. It's called additionality. So we ask all the time, what is the additionality of this project? the word doesn't exist, but I think it's in common use today. The project starts with that. And no project goes forward without a distinction between the financial aspects and what we call the non-financial aspects. That is the development impact, the social impact, the environmental impact, and how we're going to deal with that if there are problems. If there are, especially in environmental issues, how we're going to mitigate or work to solve the environmental concerns that are in the project.
If I may, very, very quickly,
Yes, sir.
really
Dr. Torres.
try to expand a little, because we work very closely with the Inter-American Development Bank. They are part of the Inter-American Development Bank, which is one of our implementing agencies in the GEF. You see, I think what is very crucial, and we work very hard on these safeguards to take into account these externalities. There are 2 or 3 ways of dealing with it. You have a scoring system, which is actually to make sure that there are always measures in place to address some of these issues. But the other aspect is that, this is the basis actually for the GEF. What happens is, if the private sector or the development banks would like to invest in a number of projects, what we fund, our resources are there to just pay the cost of this incrementality that we call it. Let me take one simple example. Let's assume that you want to invest in a coal power plant. Okay, you just do your feasibility studies, you come up with the cost, and this is what has to be financed. So what we do is we encourage this development bank to go for alternative models. And then, usually the alternative models are going to be always more expensive. We pay for the difference, the full cost of the difference, to make sure that we encourage you to move from the coal power plant to a more cleaner type of energy generating facility. We also put money into loan guarantees to encourage them to go into investments that are much cleaner. So there's a whole range of tools that are there to really deal with these externalities when we do business with development banks.
Thank you, Dr. Torres. I think we'll have more opportunity to ask questions about. Okay, yes, ma'am.
Actually, I'm from India, and I've worked on women's empowerment, and like thousands of women in the villages, they all are partners of this, taking loans from Interbank. And you mentioned about lack of regulation, but according to the experiences that we see was, like the bank has the money and they give the money to the women in the villages, and they feel like, wow, this is economic empowerment, and now I have a bank account open in my name, and that's a big thing for a woman in rural villages. But there is no mechanism on teaching them how to go about it. They just take the money and they use it up, and at the end of the day they don't have the money to repay back, and there is an interest that goes on. And they form like 12 to 15 members in each group, and it depends on the women itself in the villages. If the group is able to function on their own, they go on. If not, they die. And most of the groups now, they can't exist anymore because they are not able to pay back. And the way things have been functioning is that they just give the money, but even in the market itself, when the women makes small products like the business, when they have to compete at the global level, none of their products were bought. And I think this is the loophole that's taking place at the grassroots, when we look at the villages. And in India now, almost every women in the villages focusing on economic empowerment, every women in the villages are a part of this bank loaning system, and I don't think that they'll be able to pay back. So what's your view on that? And how do you think now, what is the lessons that the bank has learned, and how do they plan to go about it to tackle all of this?
Okay, thank you. It's a great question also. It's a hard one too to answer it, but let me tell you with ways of examples some of the things that we're doing. The Inter-American Development Bank Group has 3 branches. The Inter-American Development Bank proper, which deals mostly with governments by lending money to governments for development projects. The Inter-American Investment Corporation, where I work, where we make loans and equity investments in small and medium-sized companies, private sector, non-government guarantees. And then there is a third leg, which is called the Multilateral Investment Fund. And it's called the FOMIN in Spanish. The FOMIN is endowed with contributions from donors, that's mostly governments, mostly the United States and Japan and other countries in Europe and in Latin America have contributed resources. And one of their focuses is in microfinance institutions. And the key is, as I said before, is in education. You can empower people to do things, but if you don't educate them, it's going to be hard to make these people be responsible borrowers. We were founding shareholders of a bank in Bolivia called Banco Sol, S-O-L, out of Solidarity, Banco Solidario. And it is a replica, or the concept came out of the bank, the famous Grameen Bank, and we took the model out of there. There were many NGOs doing this kind of work in Bolivia, and they approached the IIC to see how we can lend money to the NGO. And we said, we cannot lend money to NGOs, but looking at what you're doing, why don't you create a bank? And we'll be part of it. And we invested money, I think it was $2 million, into the capital of this bank. And they were, as soon as they saw us coming in, others decided to put money as well. And we created this Banco Solidario, and their track record is that they make about, I think it's more than 10,000 loans, more than 5,000 loans per month, and the average size of the loans is less than $500. And the delinquency is very low. Why? Because we four here are going to form a solidarity group. I make the loan. If I don't pay, they pay for me. And if they don't pay, I pay for them. So we engage and we say, we're going to support each other. And it has worked. And I think that before that process happens, there has been a process of education. Training people to know that what does it mean to be part of a solidarity group. Now, it's easier said than done. I can tell you that for sure. But I think that it has been worth trying. The FOMIN is doing great work working with microfinance institutions. Actually, there's a forum that happens every year. They call it Problematique. That happens every year in Latin America that brings out and puts lessons learned on the table. And many people come and make presentations about the challenges they're facing. And I think it's a good way to show that it can work. I don't say that it's perfect, but I think we're trying.
Would either of our panelists like to respond?
I have a great story.
Please, Dr. Mulder.
I can help, but I can tell you two stories of how development works. And again, my passion is different to your passion. I admire again what you're doing, and I think I wish I were like you, in that sense, in what you're doing. But what we do is try to make companies better companies, and try to avoid future conflicts. So I'll give you two examples. One was in Argentina. Company comes to the IIC and says, I need $2 million to invest in our leather company, producing leather products. It took us about 10 seconds to say no. Why? Because leather processing uses chromium, and that is very pollutant. And normally that chromium is then thrown into the sewage systems. So we said, forget it. We don't want to get our hands there. They came back. Please lend us the money. No. Please lend us the money. No. Nobody comes to our little town, Las Toscas in northern Argentina, not the public banks, not the private banks. Come on, give us a hand. So we said, okay, let us try. We're going to give you a hand. We're going to hire an expert in leather, send it down to your town and to your company with no commitment from our side. We use donor resources from the Italian government that have given us €1 million for technical assistance, and we'll see what happens. So we send an expert from Italy. He goes down, he stays there 2 weeks, he comes back, gives a report and says, great company, great project, but unless they invest $500,000 more in the installation of a water treatment facility, they won't be able to get certifications, and they will be able to export that leather, and there is no local market for the amount of leather that they want to produce with the expansion of the company. And I looked at the numbers, and they can pay it back. Lend them the $2.5 million. $500,000 earmarked for the treatment facility. So, okay, so we called the company. Say, okay, we'll do it. We lend you not only $2 million, we lend you $2.5 million. $500,000 goes to the treatment plant. No, we don't want to get into too much debt. Sorry, thank you, but no thank you. I said, okay, bye-bye. They came back. Okay, we'll take it. And they took the $2.5 million. We negotiated the loan, nice interest rates, all the bells and whistles were put into the contract, especially that $500,000 went to the treatment plant. They did it. Guess what? They called and said, give us the name of the consultant again. We want to hire him. So they called Italy. They hired the same consultant. He went back to Argentina, and the guy said, you know what? You're in the wrong business. You're producing leather for furniture. What you should do is convert this company into a plant that produces leather for car seats, for cars, automobiles. And he put them in contact with companies in Europe. Fiat in Italy, BMW and the others in Germany, Volvo in Sweden, and they converted the whole plant into a leather factory for car seats. And that was in the 1990s, 98, 99. 2001, the Argentina crisis hit hard. The country went down. That company was clean, no problem. They paid their loan back, and they said, thank you very much. You made us do the right thing, and it paid off. One last example.
Yes.
Water.
Water, yeah.
We financed a hydroelectric plant in Ecuador, a 29 megawatt hydroelectric plant. And we financed it with a $6 million loan from the IIC. It's a private investment. And then we realized, these guys can apply for carbon credits. They can sell carbon credits in the market and get some money out of it. And we told them, hey guys, why don't you sell carbon credits? We're too busy. Hey guys, you should do this. The only thing is that you have to pay for an audit and get a certification. It's going to cost you about $40,000. Thank you, but no thank you. Then we told them, guys, do it. You can get $2 million if you sell the carbon credits. Nah, we're too busy. $40,000? No. Then we told them, okay, we pay the $40,000 and you do it. And they said, no, thanks, but no thanks. I said, come on, these guys are stubborn. And then we found the key. We thought, okay, we pay for the study, we handhold you through all the process, and if you get the carbon credits and you invest the money back into the project, we lower the interest rate by half a percentage point. I said, okay, now I'm interested. And they did it. They did it. We got the consultant, they got the certification, they went to the World Bank, they got the carbon credit, they sold them, they got $2 million. They invested the money into the project, we lowered the interest rate half a basis point. It can be done. Sometimes you have to force my hands, but that's the type of thing that we do.
That is a magnificent way to end this session. Cassie will come up here and tell us about the rest of the evening. And in the meantime, I thank you enthusiastically from the bottom of my heart.
A few last words.
Yeah, so I think at this point, feel free to stay and have more food, but we're going to be concluding this evening's symposium. And I think there was a lot of takeaway from what was said. I would like to thank the panelists for a fantastic discussion. I cannot thank them enough for showing up and being able to sit down with us and interface with us on a face-to-face level, not just on a panel discussion level. So thank you very much to all of you, and thank you for attending. We will be doing some surveys. We'll be sending out some surveys afterwards via email through for those of you who have registered and for those of you who have signed up. So please do fill out those surveys. They really help us in gearing future symposiums and workshops for our working group and what we're going to do in the future. We would like to invite the panelists and their friends and colleagues to attend these kind of meetings, and it just starts from here, starting at the local level. Literally, we targeted individuals who are here in Washington, D.C., and they could talk on a vast array of issues internationally and here right here at home across the river. So, and that's fantastic, and that's a common theme that we've been discussing, that the local and the global is interconnected, and one cannot exist without the other. So thank you very much, and hope you enjoyed the rest of the evening, and we'll hopefully see you next time. Thank you.